Hey warriors! A 94-year-old man sits on a porch in Sicily, watching his grandson mow a lawn he will never see finished growing back. He isn't sad. He isn't scrolling through regrets. He built a stone wall on that property 40 years ago, and it's still standing, and he knows exactly why. He never once mistook motion for progress. Every hour of his life had a target. Every year he could name what it built. Most people reach 94 with a mountain of hours behind them and nothing to point to. He reached it with a wall, a business, 3 sons who don't flinch when life gets hard, and a silence in his chest that most men chase for decades and never catch. That silence is not luck. It's arithmetic. It's what happens when a person stops leaking time into places that don't pay it back. You are leaking time right now. Not in some abstract poetic way, in a literal countable way. Somewhere in your day there is a crack in the floor, and hours are falling through it, and you've gotten so used to the sound of them falling that you no longer hear it. The Stoics built their entire philosophy around sealing that crack, not through positivity, not through hacks, through brutal, unsentimental truth-telling about where time actually goes and why. What follows are 7 of those truths, pulled from 7 different men who each stared at the same problem from a different angle and arrived at the same conclusion. The man who wastes time is not unlucky. He is untrained. Read these as instructions, not inspiration. If you're ready to stop leaking time and start building, comment this below before we go any further. I build today. Truth 1. You do not have tomorrow. You have never had tomorrow. Seneca ran the finances of an empire and still found himself furious at how his fellow Romans treated their own lives. He watched senators guard their villas with armed men and their fortunes with lawyers, and then hand out their days for free to anyone who asked. He said the strange thing wasn't that they wasted time, it's that they didn't even notice they were doing it, because time doesn't announce its departure the way money does. Seneca wrote, "People are frugal with their possessions, but as soon as it comes to squandering time, they are most wasteful of the one thing in which it is right to be stingy." Sit with the imbalance in that sentence. A man will argue for 10 minutes over the price of bread, and then burn 3 hours he'll never get back on a screen that gave him nothing. He'll lock his front door twice and leave his calendar wide open to anyone who wants a piece of it. This isn't a character flaw unique to Roman senators. It's the default setting of the human animal, and it hasn't updated in 2,000 years. Here's the mechanism. Money loss is visible. A number goes down, and something in your gut reacts. Time loss is invisible until it isn't. Until you're 46 and realize the skill you meant to learn at 26 never got learned, the book never got written, the body never got built, and there is no receipt to show you where the hours went. You can't audit them. They're gone the way breath is gone, replaced instantly by new breath so you never feel the absence. This is why tomorrow is the most dangerous word in your vocabulary. Not because tomorrow won't come, usually it does, but because the promise of it lets you off the hook today. You tell yourself you'll start the business next month, call your father next week, fix your health after this next deadline. Each delay costs nothing in the moment, which is exactly the trick. The cost is deferred until it compounds into a life spent in the waiting room. Marcus Aurelius, ruling from horseback in the middle of plague and war, wrote to himself that a man should act, speak, and think as if he might depart from life this very moment. He didn't write that to scare himself. He wrote it because the Emperor of Rome, with more resources than any human alive, still only had access to one currency that mattered, and it wasn't gold. You already know this intellectually. Everybody does. What separates the man who acts on it from the man who nods and closes the video is a single decision: to treat every remaining day like the only asset you actually own, because it is. There's a version of this truth that goes deeper than the obvious warning about mortality, and it's the version Seneca actually spent most of his writing on. It isn't just that you might die tomorrow. It's that even if you live another 50 years, most of those years will be consumed by things that were never yours to begin with. Sleep takes a third. Obligation, bureaucracy, and other people's emergencies take another chunk you never agreed to hand over. Illness, grief, and the slow erosion of energy that comes with age take more still. By the time you subtract everything that isn't truly discretionary, the actual usable years, the ones where you have both the health and the freedom to build something, are a fraction of the number printed on a birth certificate. Seneca's real argument wasn't you might die soon. It was you have far less than you think, even in the best-case scenario, and almost no one budgets their ambitions against that smaller, honest number. This is why the trap of tomorrow is so much more expensive than it looks. It's not one day lost. It's a pattern that, repeated for a decade, quietly consumes the entire discretionary portion of a life, while the person living it assumes they're still in the warm-up phase. The senator in Seneca's letters wasn't lazy. He was busy every day of his life. He simply never noticed that busy and spent are not the same word, and by the time he did notice, there was no year left to spend correctly. If this hits something in you, comment the word below. Let it be the last time you need reminding. I built now. Truth 2. Busy is not the same as building. Epictetus was born a slave. He understood, better than any philosopher who came after him, that a man can be in chains and still be free, and a man can be free and still be enslaved to his own noise. He spent his life teaching Roman aristocrats, men with every comfort available to them, and he watched most of them fill their days with activity that led nowhere. He said, "It is not death or hardship that is a fearful thing, but the fear of death or hardship." Turn that lens on wasted time, and you find the same trap wearing a different mask. Most people aren't afraid of failure directly. They're afraid of the moment right before failure. The vulnerable stretch where you commit to something and it might not work. So instead of committing, they generate motion. Motion feels like courage because it's tiring and it fills the hours. But motion without a target is just fear wearing a business suit. Look at how this shows up. A man spends 4 hours researching the business he wants to start, watching videos about other people who already built theirs. He tells himself this is preparation. It's avoidance dressed as diligence. A woman rewrites the same paragraph of her book 9 times, calling it perfectionism, when the truth is that an unfinished draft can't be rejected and a finished one can. The rewriting is a hiding place with good lighting. Epictetus drew a hard line between what is in your control and what isn't, and he insisted that peace only comes from obsessing over the first category and ignoring the second. Wasted time almost always happens in that second category, worrying about outcomes you can't control instead of executing the actions you can. You cannot control whether the business succeeds. You can control whether you send the email today. The man who confuses these two spends his whole life managing anxiety about outcomes and never gets around to the inputs that actually move him. This is the second brutal truth. Your calendar can be completely full and your life can still be completely empty, because being occupied and being directed are not the same discipline. One exhausts you. The other builds something that outlives the exhaustion. Ask yourself tonight what you did today that you could point to in 5 years, not what you were busy with, what you built. If the honest answer is nothing, you already know which category consumed your day. Epictetus taught his students a specific exercise for catching this trap in real time, and it still works exactly as designed. Before starting any task, ask what the task is actually for. Not what it looks like, not how it will be perceived, but what concrete change it produces in the world once it's finished. Research that never leads to a decision isn't preparation. It's a loop with no exit. A draft that never gets submitted isn't perfectionism. It's a hiding place with extra steps. The exercise is uncomfortable because it strips away every excuse that motion normally hides behind. Most people, run through this filter honestly, discover that less than half of what fills their day would survive the question, what is this actually building? The rest is noise wearing the costume of effort. The deeper trap Epictetus identified is that motion is self-rewarding in a way that real building often isn't, at least at first. Watching 10 videos about starting a business releases the same low hum of accomplishment as actually starting one without any of the risk. This is precisely why so many intelligent, capable people stay stuck for years in a holding pattern that feels productive from the inside. The feeling is real, the output isn't, and a life spent chasing the feeling instead of the output is a life that will look, from a distance, exactly like busyness and nothing like a body of work. Comment this one if you've caught yourself confusing motion for progress. I build direction. Truth 3. Comfort is alone with brutal interest. Cleanthes worked nights hauling water so he could study philosophy by day under Zeno, and he did this for years while wealthier students mocked him for it. He wasn't chasing comfort. He understood something the comfortable men around him didn't. Every hour you spend avoiding difficulty today gets billed back to you later with interest, in a currency far more expensive than the discomfort you dodged. Cleanthes is remembered for insisting that the willing are led by fate, while the unwilling are dragged. Apply that to your own resistance. The task you're avoiding, the hard conversation, the workout, the cold outreach, the confrontation with your own finances, doesn't disappear because you avoid it. It waits. And while it waits, it grows, because problems left untouched rarely stay the same size. The difficult conversation you postpone for 6 months isn't the same conversation 6 months later. It's heavier, because resentment has had time to compound on both sides. This is the quiet arithmetic behind procrastination that almost nobody says out loud. Delay isn't neutral. It's not a pause button. It's a loan, and the interest rate is whatever emotional and practical cost accumulates while you wait. The gym membership you don't use still charges your card. The skill you don't practice still gets rustier in your hands. The relationship you don't repair still cools in the silence you left it in. Compare 2 men doing the same unpleasant task. Say, an honest look at their spending. One does it the first week of the problem, when it's a 15-minute conversation with a spreadsheet. The other avoids it for 3 years, until it's a crisis requiring lawyers, or family intervention, or a bankruptcy filing. Same task, wildly different cost. The only variable was how long the loan of avoidance was allowed to accrue interest. Cleanthes chose the water-hauling nights because he understood that discomfort accepted early is cheap, and comfort purchased today is paid for later, at a markup you can't negotiate. This is why Stoic training so often looks from the outside like people choosing hardship for no reason. Cold showers, hard conversations, blunt honesty. They aren't masochists. They're paying down debt before the interest sets in. Look at your own life and find the loan you're currently taking out. The unopened bill, the unresolved conflict, the unstarted project. Every day you don't touch it, the interest ticks up quietly, and you won't feel the full weight of it until the day it's due. What makes this particularly brutal is that the interest rate is rarely fixed. It's compounding, and it compounds fastest in exactly the domains people avoid the longest. A body neglected for a year needs a year of correction. A body neglected for a decade often needs medical intervention that a year of neglect never would have required. A conversation avoided for a week is awkward. The same conversation avoided for 3 years has usually calcified into a grudge that neither party fully remembers the origin of, only the resentment. Cleanthes hauled water at night specifically because he'd done the arithmetic on this. The discomfort of studying while exhausted was fixed and bounded, while the discomfort of staying uneducated and poor for the rest of his life was neither fixed nor bounded. He wasn't choosing suffering for its own sake. He was choosing the cheaper loan. There's a second layer to this most people miss entirely. Avoidance doesn't just delay the cost. It usually adds a second cost on top of the original one, the cost of having lived in the meantime with the low-grade anxiety of knowing the thing is still out there, unresolved. That background hum of, "I still need to deal with that," is itself a tax, paid daily on top of whatever the eventual reckoning will cost. People rarely count this tax because it doesn't arrive as a single bill. It arrives as a slightly worse version of every single day until the debt gets paid. If you know exactly which loan I'm describing right now, comment it below. I pay now. Truth 4. Your attention is the only property you actually own. Marcus Aurelius ruled the largest empire on earth and still understood with total clarity that none of it belonged to him in any lasting sense. Not the throne, not the armies, not even his own body, which would fail and return to the earth regardless of his rank. The only thing he could claim as truly his, the only thing that was his to direct, protect or squander, was where he pointed his attention in any given moment. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Most people live as though the opposite is true. They act as though their attention belongs to whoever asks for it loudest. The notification, the argument, the stranger's opinion, the algorithm engineered by people who are paid based on how many hours of your one life they can extract. Every ping you answer without deciding to is a small transfer of ownership. You didn't choose to give that attention away. It was simply taken because you left the door unlocked. This is the least visible form of wasted time and the most expensive. You can lose an afternoon to a task you chose badly and still have made a decision. You lose something worse when you never decided at all. When the day simply happened to you, pulled in a dozen directions by forces that have no stake in your life beyond the seconds they can extract from it. Marcus understood that an empire is easier to defend than a mind because an empire has walls, and a mind does not build its own unless you build them deliberately. He guarded his attention the way a general guards a border, because he knew that a man who cannot control what he thinks about cannot control what he does, and a man who cannot control what he does is not, in any meaningful sense, free, regardless of the title in front of his name. Here is the test. At the end of today, will you be able to say where your attention went and why? Or will you only be able to say what happened to you? One of those is ownership, the other is trespassing on your own life. Marcus Aurelius wrote his private journal, the collection now known to the world, almost entirely as a series of reminders to himself about this exact discipline, because he understood something uncomfortable about power. Rank does not grant self-command. It only raises the number of people trying to steal your attention for their own ends. As emperor, he had generals who wanted his attention on war, senators who wanted it on politics, and a household that wanted it on ceremony, and every single one of them believed their claim was the most urgent. If the Emperor of Rome had to fight daily to keep his own mind from being colonized by other people's priorities, the idea that an ordinary person could protect their attention passively, without training, without a daily practice of reclaiming it, is close to fantasy. This is why he treated his journal as maintenance rather than reflection. Not a diary of feelings, but a toolkit he sharpened every morning, so that when the day's demands arrived, he already knew which of them deserved his mind, and which was simply loud. The people who waste the most attention today are rarely the ones under the least pressure. They're often the ones under the most, because pressure is exactly what makes a mind vulnerable to whatever shows up first and shouts the loudest, rather than what actually matters most. Comment below if you're done letting your attention be taken instead of given. I own this. Truth 5. Discipline practiced in public is not the discipline that counts. Musonius Rufus taught that philosophy without daily practice was worthless decoration. Words a man wears to look impressive rather than a structure he actually lives inside. He pushed his students toward an uncomfortable question. Does your discipline exist when no one is watching? Or does it only appear on the days an audience might notice? He said, if you accomplish something good with hard work, the labor passes quickly, but the good endures. If you do something shameful in pursuit of pleasure, the pleasure passes quickly, but the shame endures. Most wasted time hides exactly where no one is looking. The workout you skip when your trainer isn't watching. The extra hour of sleep you steal instead of the deep work you promised yourself, in a room with no witnesses to hold you accountable. Public discipline is easy, because it's really just performance. And performance is cheap when the audience is what you're optimizing for. Private discipline, the version that happens in an empty room at 6 in the morning with nobody to post it to, is the only version that actually compounds into a life. This is why so many people can look impressive from the outside and still feel hollow on the inside. They've built a discipline that only exists under observation. The moment the observation stops, so does the behavior, and the gap between the public image and the private reality becomes the exact size of the time they've wasted maintaining an illusion instead of building a life. Musonius Rufus lived this test personally. He was exiled more than once for refusing to soften his teaching to please men in power, and in exile, stripped of audience, stripped of status, his habits didn't change. That consistency was the entire proof of his philosophy. A man's real discipline is whatever remains once every spectator has left the room. Ask yourself honestly, if no one could ever find out what you did today, would you have done the same things? If the answer is no, you've found the exact size of the gap between the life you're performing and the life you're actually building. This test matters more now than it did in Musonius Rufus's time, not less, because the machinery for performing discipline in public has never been cheaper or more available. It costs nothing to announce a goal. It costs nothing to post the first day of a routine. The gap Musonius identified between what a person does and what a person is seen doing used to require real effort to fake, which meant most people simply didn't bother and defaulted to honesty by necessity. That friction is gone now. A person can build an entire audience around a discipline they've practiced for exactly one day, and the applause arrives before the work does, which is precisely backwards from how durable skill has ever been built. The private version of discipline has no such shortcut, and that's exactly why it's the only version that produces anything real. Nobody is clapping for the 6th rep at 6 in the morning. Nobody is watching the 40th page of a manuscript that has no readers yet. The absence of an audience is uncomfortable, specifically because it removes every reason to continue, except the only reason that has ever actually built anything. You decided the outcome mattered enough to pursue it whether or not a single other person ever found out. If you're ready to close that gap, comment it below. Unseen and steady. Truth 6. The fear of judgment costs more than the judgment itself. Zeno of Citium lost his fortune in a shipwreck on the way to Athens, walked away from the wreck with nothing, and ended up founding an entire school of philosophy from the accident. He didn't waste years mourning the ship. He understood something that most people spend a lifetime avoiding. The opinions of strangers, which feel enormous in the moment, dissolve almost instantly and cost you nothing real, while the fear of those opinions can quietly consume years of a life that was never actually threatened. Zeno is said to have taught that a man's worth is measured by what he's willing to give his attention to, not by what others say about the giving. Consider how much time gets spent rehearsing conversations that never happen, defending decisions no one has attacked, editing a version of yourself for an audience that in most cases is barely thinking about you at all. This isn't a minor leak. For a huge number of people, it's the single largest drain on their potential, bigger than laziness, bigger than bad luck, bigger than lack of resources. Here's the brutal part. The judgment you're afraid of rarely arrives in the form you imagined, and when it does arrive, it rarely lasts. People forget your mistakes faster than you do, because they're consumed with the exact same fear about their own. Everyone is starring in a movie about themselves, and you have a much smaller supporting role in it than your anxiety insists. Meanwhile, the years you spent managing a fear that mostly existed in your own head are real years, permanently spent on a threat that was mostly imaginary. Zeno walked out of that shipwreck and, according to the account passed down through the centuries, went looking for a bookseller instead of a search party for his losses. He didn't perform grief for an audience of strangers on the docks. He simply moved toward what was still available to build. That's the whole lesson, compressed into a single decision made on a foreign shore with nothing left but his own judgment to rely on. There's a specific mechanism worth naming here because it explains why this fear feels so disproportionate to its actual stakes. The brain evolved in small groups where a stranger's disapproval could genuinely threaten your survival. Exile from the tribe was often a death sentence. That wiring never updated for a world of billions of strangers whose opinions carry none of that ancestral weight, which means the emotional alarm still fires at full volume for a threat that, in the modern context, is almost always harmless. Zeno didn't have the language of evolutionary psychology, but he'd identified the practical fix centuries before anyone could explain the mechanism. Treat the alarm as data about your own nervous system, not as an accurate measure of actual danger, and act on the actual danger instead of the alarm. The years this fear consumes rarely announce themselves as fear. They show up as delayed launches, unsent messages, softened opinions, and careers kept smaller than the person's actual capability, all justified with reasonable-sounding words like "not the right time" or "still refining it." Strip away the polite language and what's usually underneath is a person managing an audience that, in most cases, was never paying nearly as much attention as the fear assumed. If you've spent this year managing an imagined audience instead of building for the real one that will actually remember you, your family, your work, your own future self, comment below and let this be the year that changes. No audience needed. Truth. 7. A life well spent doesn't need to be long to be complete. Chrysippus took over the Stoic school after Zeno and Cleanthes and became, by most accounts, the most prolific writer among all of them. Hundreds of scrolls, entire systems of logic built from nothing, an output so large that later Stoics joked no one could out-argue him, because no one could outwrite him either. And yet even Chrysippus, staring down the sheer size of his own output, taught that the length of a life was never the measure that mattered. What mattered was whether the life, however long or short, had been completed on its own terms. He argued that a play isn't judged by how many acts it runs, it's judged by whether the final scene resolves what the earlier scenes set in motion. A short play, well constructed, is complete. A long play that meanders and never resolves is not, no matter how many additional acts get added to it. He applied the same logic to a human life. Duration was never the Stoic obsession. Completion was. This reframes everything the previous 6 truths have been building toward. You are not actually racing a clock that ends at some arbitrary old age. You're building something that needs to be able to stand as complete at any point it might end, because none of the previous truths in this list, not one, guarantee you the tomorrow you're planning around. The man from the opening of this video didn't build his wall because he expected to live to 94. He built it because building was the only response available to him that didn't waste the day he was standing in. Chrysippus wrote densely, technically, sometimes obscurely, but underneath the logic was a simple demand: don't wait for a future version of your circumstances to become the man you're capable of being today. The scroll doesn't finish itself because you have more scrolls left to write. It finishes because you finished it, on the day you were given, with the tools you had. There's a reason this particular truth was left for last, and it isn't accidental. Every truth before it could be misread as a kind of pressure. Hurry, because time is short. Hurry, because the loan is compounding. Hurry, because the audience you're afraid of doesn't actually exist. Read that way. The first 6 truths risk producing exactly the kind of frantic, anxious motion that Truth 2 already warned against. Chrysippus's insight is the correction. The goal was never speed for its own sake. The goal was completion, and completion has nothing to do with how much time is left on the clock. A single well-built day, structured with intention and finished without leaking its hours into distraction, avoidance or performance, is already a whole unit of a life well spent, regardless of what happens tomorrow. This is also why the Stoics never treated death as morbid subject matter, despite how often they wrote about it. Death was simply the deadline that made the completion standard honest. Without an ending, a person can always tell themselves there's more time to tidy up the unfinished parts later. With an ending built into the frame from the start, the only reasonable response is to build each day as though it might have to stand on its own, which, compounded across 100 honest days, produces exactly the kind of life the man on the porch had at 94. Not a life that happened to run long. A life where every individual day had already done its job. This is the truth that makes the other 6 actionable instead of theoretical. Not someday when conditions are right. Today, with what's already in your hands, structured well enough that if this were the final scene, it would still resolve into something worth having lived. If you're finished waiting for the right conditions and ready to build with what's already in front of you, comment it below. Complete today. 7 men. 7 centuries apart in some cases, separated by empires, exile, slavery, shipwrecks and thrones, and every one of them arrived at the same unglamorous conclusion. Time isn't wasted through disaster. It's wasted through 1,000 small permissions granted to comfort, fear, distraction and delay, none of which announce themselves as the enemy while they're taking your hours. The old man on the porch in Sicily isn't remarkable because he lived to 94. Plenty of men do that and leave nothing behind but a longer version of the same wasted pattern. He's remarkable because every decade of his life could stand on its own as complete. That's not an accident of long life. That's the compounding result of 1,000 ordinary days, each one spent instead of leaked. You have today. That's the whole inheritance. Seneca would tell you to stop being frugal with your money and reckless with your hours. Epictetus would tell you to stop mistaking motion for direction. Cleanthes would tell you the bill for today's comfort comes due with interest. Marcus would tell you to guard your attention like an empire. Musonius would tell you to build a discipline no one has to witness for it to be real. Zeno would tell you the judgment you fear is smaller and shorter-lived than the years you'd spend avoiding it. And Chrysippus would tell you that none of this needs decades to matter. It needs a single day, finished well. Build the wall, not someday, today.